Speaker Mike Johnson, the House unanimously voting to elect him this afternoon after 3 weeks of failed attempts to replace Kevin McCarthy. Johnson now thrown into the fire to tackle a list of pressing tasks here at home and abroad. NTD's Melina Wisecup joins us now from Capitol Hill to discuss. So, Melina, tell us more about this new United States Speaker of the House.
Well, Steve, I think the fact that Johnson was unanimously elected by the most conservative members of the Republican conference and the most moderate members of the conference, it could be an indicator that he is able to bridge the gap between the two and unify the conference. But he is a very new member of leadership. He's very new to Congress, for that matter. He's only a fourth-term congressman. Specifically, he's from Louisiana, which is interesting. Now we have two members in leadership from Louisiana, both himself and Steve Scalise, who's the majority leader right now. He did serve in some capacity in somewhat of a leadership position. He was elected this Congress as the vice chair of the Republican conference. He also served before in the capacity of the chairman of the House Republican Study Committee. So he does have some leadership experience, but those are very low-level leadership positions. So it will be interesting to see how he treads the waters facing all of these difficult problems. He's also an attorney, which he says in that capacity he values very much protecting fundamental freedoms and traditional values. He's very much a religious person, which is very adamant, which is very clear. And, you know, we saw that throughout his speech today. He gave a very strong theme of faith. Take a look at what Johnson had to say just moments after being elected.
I was reminded of the scripture that says suffering produces perseverance, perseverance produces character, and character produces hope. What we need in this country is more hope. The people have lost their faith in our institutions. Their faith is at an all-time low. And one of the reasons they've lost it is because the Congress, over the years, has not delivered for the American people well enough. We're in the majority right now. We've gone through a little bit of suffering.
And Steve, it was very interesting to see how short that he actually spoke for. That speech that you just heard a bit from was only about 4 minutes long. And right after that, he immediately took members back to the House floor to start debating and taking a vote on a resolution to condemn the Hamas attacks on Israel. So we see that's his first order of business.
So, Melina, he enters now at a relatively tough time with issues mounting both domestically and abroad. What exactly is he up against right now as he takes the Speaker's chair?
Definitely quite a bit. So not only is he having to deal with the fact that now he's facing pressure from Democrats in the Senate and in the White House to combine aid for Israel with aid to Ukraine, which some conservatives just aren't willing to go for. He'll have to worry about how to navigate these waters, as well as a fast approaching deadline for that government funding that runs out in less than a month from now on November 17th. Now, Johnson, he did lay out a plan to sort of quickly try to speed up their appropriations bills process so they can finish passing them. But he did propose that if they weren't able to do it on time, they could pass another continuing resolution that is a short-term funding bill that would expire in January or sometime next April, depending on how much support he has within the Republican conference. But regardless of his spending approach, he didn't even have to make any promises to gain the support of the most conservative members, especially the most fiscal conservative members in his conference, who were telling me they're in full support behind him, even without him having to make any promises or concessions about spending. Take a look at what those members had to say to me.
We know his heart, and we know where he's at, and we know he's about single issue funding bills.
Everybody knows he's very different from the previous speaker, who even yesterday and as early as this morning was trying to undermine this very election that every Republican voted for.
Look, Speaker Johnson, I think, has an instinct to want to be, as he said from the rostrum, a limited government conservative that believes we ought to restrain and cut spending, that we ought to do our job to secure the United States. And I think he was clear about that.
So, Steve, it's clear that he has that solid support from the most conservative members of his party, the ones who dare to oust Speaker Kevin McCarthy, which is very important. But there's also a big question as to how well he'll work across the aisle with Democrats. I did speak to Steny Hoyer, who's the former majority leader of the Democratic Party. They said that Democrats just don't know Johnson, which honestly could work in his favor as he has to work with them throughout the rest of this Congress. Steve?
Well, Melina, it appears as though that chapter is closed, at least for now. However, the motion to vacate still remains. So I guess To be continued, perhaps. But for now, thank you, Melina. Appreciate it. And following the end of the speakership race, President Biden today congratulating the new House Speaker Mike Johnson on his election. The White House is encouraging bipartisanship and the importance of finding common ground. President Biden today sending a direct warning to Beijing as he welcomes the Australian Prime Minister to the White House. The two leaders vowing to uphold peace in the Indo-Pacific amid wars in Europe and the Middle East. NTD's Iris Tao has more from the White House.
As tensions rise in the Middle East, President Biden today stressing the strategic importance of the Indo-Pacific. He tells Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese that their alliance is
an anchor to peace and prosperity in the Indo-Pacific.
And Biden directly warning Beijing that its latest aggressive actions in the South China Sea could trigger the involvement of U.S. troops.
Just this past week, the PRC vessels acted dangerously and unlawfully. Any attack on the Filipino aircraft vessels or armed forces will invoke our mutual defense treaty with the Philippines.
Biden says he's not looking for a conflict, but both leaders emphasize the need to compete with Beijing. Biden also vowed to get more funding for the AUKUS deal to get Australia nuclear-powered submarines, a move viewed as another bid to counter China's military ambitions in the Pacific. Meanwhile, as Israel prepares for a ground offensive into Gaza, President Biden today lays out this as his vision about what future he seeks.
Israelis and Palestinians equally deserve to live side by side, ensuring Hamas can no longer terrorize Israel.
And while Biden urges Israel to be incredibly careful to focus on going after Hamas and avoid hurting civilians, he says he has, quote, no confidence in the casualty numbers being reported by the Hamas-run Gaza Health Ministry. Reporting from the White House, Iris Tao, NTD News.
And as the United Nations calling for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, Washington is pledging unwavering support to Israel. Could the U.S. be forced into the war in the Middle East, however? To discuss, let's bring in Michael Ohanlan, Senior Fellow and Director of Research in Foreign Policy at the Brookings Institution. Michael Ohanlan, thank you so much for joining us.
Nice to be with you today.
Of course, Michael, first, I want to get your thoughts on Israel. The UN is now calling for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, while the Biden administration warning that a ceasefire would only benefit Hamas. What are the potential implications right now?
Well, these are fascinating contending points of view because you can understand each of them. For the UN, this is being seen as primarily a humanitarian crisis on both sides, but now a crisis where obviously the main victims day to day are Palestinians. And after a couple weeks almost of a virtual siege by Israel, you can understand also how the plight of most of the 2 million Palestinians in Gaza would be poor. For Israel, of course, this is a war against Hamas, an organization that just conducted the equivalent of 9/11 attack against Israel and remains, for the moment, still the power to be, or power that be, inside of Gaza, still essentially the government. I don't think a ceasefire is the right answer because, as the Biden administration has said, Hamas could use that ceasefire to further fortify itself, for its leaders to get away, what have you. But I think that a greater urgency with providing humanitarian relief is essential, even at the risk of some slowdown of battlefield operations. And so I think that's the right way to frame it. Not that we should have a ceasefire, but that there needs to be a higher priority on near-term, high-level, relief at scale of what the Palestinians in Gaza need today, and it's much more than the amount of supplies getting through so far.
Michael, officials told the Financial Times that the U.S. is now rushing defensive systems into the region in fears that Iran will escalate attacks on U.S. forces. What do you think is the current likelihood of this conflict spreading? Will we be forced to enter a war in the Middle East?
Well, there's two things there, and I'm glad you broke them apart. First, the conflict could spread. I think the chances are less than 50-50. But of course, I don't quite know how Hezbollah in particular will be looking at the pros and cons of opening a second front. And Hezbollah certainly is not beyond such a decision on moral grounds. It's attacked Israel a number of times before, but it also is influential within Lebanon, probably doesn't want to see its own power within Lebanon jeopardized or Lebanon itself overly disrupted, and therefore it may decide in the end not to launch a major attack. But, it's probably got to be somewhere in the range of between 10% and 50%. I would put it right in the middle and say roughly 25% plus or minus of a wider war. Then there's the separate question, as you put it, and I think you're correct, of whether the United States would then get involved in any such second front. I think we'd have to evaluate to what extent Israel really is in such a dire straits that it couldn't handle both fronts itself, because I don't know that we're any better positioned to fight Hezbollah or fight Iran than Israel would be. And my guess is Iran is not going to be overtly part of any attack. And therefore, the idea of attacking Iran directly would be less than fully compelling, or at least require a lot of additional analysis before you conclude that's really something you want to risk. And if it winds up being Hezbollah against Israel, I think we should think twice before we get involved.
Now, President Biden today reiterating U.S. support for Ukraine, and the administration is asking for about $60 billion for Ukraine in addition to aid to Israel. What are some trends that you're seeing about American support for Ukraine, and is the Biden administration effective in convincing those who might be hesitant?
Yeah, you're right about the amounts. And, for the shorthand version, I say that this $105 billion proposed supplemental package is about $60 billion for Ukraine, about $15 billion for Taiwan, about $15 billion for Israel, about $10 billion for the border crisis and the fentanyl problem, and then about $4 billion for the submarine industrial base. So those are the big chunks. And certainly the American public has a right to ask, how long are we going to provide money and support and weaponry to Ukraine to the tune of roughly $50 billion a year? That's essentially been the pace for the last 2 years, and that would be the implied pace if Biden got all this additional funding. And I think that the answer should be that Ukraine really does deserve the help now. I think President Biden might do well to explain that to the American people. So far, he simply said, we're going to help Ukraine for as long as it takes. And I don't know that an open-ended commitment like that is fully satisfying for American skeptics. I do think Biden's right that we have to provide a lot of support now, and that this is an important fight for Ukraine to prevail in, or at least not to lose. And it's important for our own security here in the United States and in NATO as well. But it doesn't mean that we would reinforce a stalemate forever. And I think President Biden, therefore, needs to give some sense of time horizon before when he might have to reconsider and think about a plan B. A plan B would not and should not cut off Ukraine entirely, but it might have to lower expectations that we can really help them liberate all their territory.
Michael Ohanlan, really appreciate you joining us and giving your assessment. Thank you.
Thank you kindly.
Thank you for watching the Capitol Report. If you want to see our full broadcast, check us out at epochtv.com.